Aleksander Solzhenitsyn, A World Split Apart. Commencement address delivered at Harvard University, June 8, 1978. I am sincerely happy to be here with you on the occasion of the 327th commencement of this old and illustrious university. My congratulations and best wishes to all of today's graduates. Harvard's motto is Veritas. Many of you have already found out, and others will find out in the course of their lives, that truth eludes us as soon as our concentration begins to flag, all the while leaving the illusion that we are continuing to pursue it. This is the source of much discord. Also, truth seldom is sweet. It is almost invariably bitter. A measure of bitter truth is included in my speech today, but I offer it as a friend, not as an adversary. 3 years ago, in the United States, I said certain things that were rejected and appeared unacceptable. Today, however, many people agree with what I then said. The split today in today's world is perceptible, even to a hasty glance. Any of our contemporaries readily identifies two world powers, each of them already capable of utterly destroying the other. However, the understanding of the split too often is limited to this political conception. The illusion according to which danger may be abolished through successful diplomatic negotiations or by achieving a balance of armed forces. The truth is that the split is both more profound and more alienating, that the rifts are more numerous than one can see at first glance. These deep, manifold splits bear the danger of equally manifold disaster for all of us, in accordance with the ancient truth that a kingdom, in this case our earth, divided against itself, cannot stand. There is the concept of the third world. Thus, we already have 3 worlds. Undoubtedly, however, the number is even greater. We are just too far away to see. Every ancient and deeply rooted self-contained culture, especially if it is spread over a wide part of the Earth's surface, constitutes a self-contained world, full of riddles and surprises to Western thinking. As a minimum, we must include in this category China, India, the Muslim world, and Africa, if indeed we accept the approximation of viewing the latter two as uniform. For 1,000 years, Russia belonged to such a category, although Western thinking systematically committed the mistake of denying its special character and therefore never understood it, just as today the West does not understand Russia in communist captivity. And while it may be that in past years Japan has increasingly become in effect a far West, drawing ever closer to Western ways, I am no judge here, Israel, I think, should not be reckoned as part of the West, if only because of the decisive circumstance that its state system is fundamentally linked to religion. How short a time ago, relatively, the small world of modern Europe was easily seizing colonies all over the globe, not only without anticipating any real resistance, but usually with contempt for any possible values of the conquered people's approach to life. It all seemed an overwhelming success with no geographic limits. Western society expanded in a triumph of human independence and power, and all of a sudden the 20th century brought the clear realization of this society's fragility. We now see that the conquests proved to be short-lived and precarious, and this in turn points to the defects in Western view of the world, which led to these conquests. Relations with the former colonial world now have switched to the opposite extreme, and the Western world often exhibits an excess of obsequiousness, but it is difficult yet to estimate the size of the bill which former colonial countries will present to the West, and it is difficult to predict whether the surrender not only of its last colonies but of everything it owns will be sufficient for the West to clear this account. But the persisting blindness of superiority continues to hold the belief that all the vast regions of our planet should develop and mature to the level of contemporary Western systems, the best in theory and the most attractive in practice, that all those other worlds are but temporarily prevented by wicked leaders or a severe crisis or by their own barbarity and incomprehension from pursuing Western pluralistic democracy and adopting the Western way of life. Countries are judged on the merit of their progress in that direction, but in fact such a conception is a fruit of Western incomprehension of the essence of other worlds, a result of mistakenly measuring them all with a Western yardstick. The real picture of our planet's development bears little resemblance to all this. The anguish of a divided world gave birth to the theory of convergence between the leading Western countries and the Soviet Union. It is a soothing theory which overlooks the fact that these worlds are not at all evolving toward each other, and that neither one can be transformed into the other without violence. Besides, convergence means acceptance of the other side's defects too, and this can hardly suit anyone. If I were today addressing an audience in my country, in my examination of the overall pattern of the world's rifts, I would have concentrated on the calamities of the East. But since my forced exile in the West has now lasted 4 years, and since my audience is a Western one, I think it may be of greater interest to concentrate on certain aspects of the contemporary West, such as I see them. A decline in courage may be the most striking feature that an outside observer notices in the West today. The Western world has lost its civic courage, both as a whole and separately. In each country, in each government, in each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling and intellectual elites, causing an impression of a loss of courage by the entire society. There remain many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life. Political and intellectual functionaries exhibit this depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in their self-serving rationales as to how realistic, reasonable, and intellectually and even morally justified it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. And the decline in courage, at times attaining what could be termed a lack of manhood, is ironically emphasized by occasional outbursts of boldness and inflexibility on the part of those same functionaries who deal with weak governments and with countries that lack support, or with doomed currents which clearly cannot offer any resistance. But they get tongue-tied and paralyzed when they deal with powerful governments and threatening forces, with aggressors and international terrorists. Must one point out that from ancient times a decline in courage has been considered the first symptom of the end? When the modern Western states were being formed, it was proclaimed as a principle that governments are meant to serve men, and that man lives in order to be free and pursue happiness. See, for example, the American Declaration of Independence. Now at last, during past decades, technical and social progress has permitted the realization of such aspirations, the welfare state. Every citizen has been granted the desired freedom and material goods in such quantity and of such quality as to guarantee, in theory, the achievement of happiness, in the debased sense of the word which has come into being during those same decades. In the process, however, one psychological detail has been overlooked: the constant desire to have still more things and a still better life, and the struggle to this end imprint many Western faces with worry and even depression, though it is customary to carefully conceal such feelings. This active and tense competition comes to dominate all human thought, and does not in the least open a way to free spiritual development. The individual's independence from many types of state pressure has been guaranteed. The majority of the people have been granted well-being to an extent that their fathers and grandfathers could not even dream about. It has become possible to raise young people according to these ideals, preparing them for and summoning them toward physical bloom, happiness, the possession of material goods, money, and leisure, toward an almost unlimited freedom in the choice of pleasures, So who should now renounce all this? Why, and for the sake of what, should one risk one's precious life in defense of the common good, and particularly in the nebulous case when the security of one's nation must be defended in an as yet distant land? Even biology tells us that a high degree of habitual well-being is not advantageous to a living organism. Today, well-being in the life of Western society has begun to take off its pernicious mask. Western society has chosen for itself the organization best suited to its purposes, and one might call legalistic. The limits of human rights and rightness are determined by a system of laws. Such limits are very broad. People in the West have acquired considerable skill in using, interpreting, and manipulating law, though laws tend to be too complicated for the average person to understand without the help of an expert. Every conflict is solved according to the letter of the law, and this is considered to be the ultimate solution. If one is right from a legal point of view, nothing more is required. Nobody may mention that one could still not be entirely right, and urge self-restraint or a renunciation of these rights, call for sacrifice and selfless risk. This would simply sound absurd. Voluntary self-restraint is almost unheard of. Everybody strives toward further expansion to the extreme limit of the legal frames. An oil company is legally blameless when it buys up an invention of a new type of energy in order to prevent its use. A food product manufacturer is legally blameless when he poisons his produce to make it last longer. After all, people are free not to purchase it. I have spent all my life under a communist regime, and I will tell you that a society without any objective legal scale is a terrible one indeed. But a society with no other scale but the legal one is also less than worthy of man. A society based on the letter of the law and never reaching any higher fails to take advantage of the full range of human possibilities. The letter of the law is too cold and formal to have a beneficial influence on society. Whenever the tissue of life is woven of legalistic relationships, this creates an atmosphere of spiritual mediocrity that paralyzes man's noblest impulses. And it will be simply impossible to bear up to the trials of this threatening century with nothing but the supports of a legalistic structure. Today's Western society has revealed the inequality between the freedom for good deeds and the freedom for evil deeds. A statesman who wants to achieve something important and highly constructive for his country has to move cautiously and even timidly. Thousands of hasty and irresponsible critics cling to him at all times. He is constantly rebuffed by Parliament and press. He has to prove that his every step is well-founded and absolutely flawless. Indeed, an outstanding, truly great person who has unusual and unexpected initiatives in mind does not get any chance to assert himself. Dozens of traps will be set for him from the beginning. Thus, mediocrity triumphs under the guise of democratic restraint. It is feasible and easy everywhere to undermine administrative power, and it has in fact been drastically weakened in all Western countries. The defense of individual rights has reached such extremes as to make society as a whole defenseless against certain individuals. It is time in the West to defend not so much human rights as human obligations. On the other hand, destructive and irresponsible freedom has been granted boundless space. Society has turned out to have scarce defense against the abyss of human decadence. For example, against the misuse of liberty for moral violence against young people, such as motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror. This is all considered to be part of freedom and to be counterbalanced in theory by the young people's right not to look and not to accept. Life organized legalistically has thus shown its inability to defend itself against the corrosion of evil. And what shall we say about the dark realms of overt criminality? Legal limits, especially in the United States, are broad enough to encourage not only individual freedom, but also some misuse of such freedom. The culprit can go unpunished or obtain undeserved leniency, all with the support of thousands of defenders in the society. When a government earnestly undertakes to root out terrorism, public opinion immediately accuses it of violating the terrorists' civil rights. There is quite a number of such cases. This tilt of freedom toward evil has come about gradually, but it evidently stems from a humanistic and benevolent concept, according to which man, the master of this world, does not bear any evil within himself, and all the defects of life are caused by misguided social systems, which must therefore be corrected. Yet, strangely enough, though the best social conditions have been achieved in the West, there still remains a great deal of crime. There even is considerably more of it than in the destitute and lawless Soviet society. There is a multitude of prisoners in our camps who are termed criminals, but most of them never committed any crime. They merely tried to defend themselves against a lawless state by resorting to means outside the legal framework. The press, too, of course, enjoys the widest freedom. I shall be using the word press to include all the media, but what use does it make of it? Here again, the overriding concern is not to infringe the letter of the law. There is no true moral responsibility for distortion or disproportion. What sort of responsibility does a journalist or a newspaper have to the readership or to history? If they have misled public opinion by inaccurate information or wrong conclusions, even if they have contributed to mistakes on a state level, do we know of any case of open regret voiced by the same journalist or the same newspaper? No. This would damage sales. A nation may be the worst for such a mistake, but the journalist always gets away with it. It is most likely that he will start writing the exact opposite of his previous statements with renewed aplomb. Because instant and credible information is required, it becomes necessary to resort to guesswork, rumors, and suppositions to fill in the voids, and none of them will ever be refuted. They settle into the reader's memory. How many hasty, immature, superficial, and misleading judgments are expressed every day, confusing readers, and are left hanging. The press can act the role of public opinion or miseducate it. Thus we may see terrorists heroized, or secret matters pertaining to the nation's defense publicly revealed, or we may witness shameless intrusions into the privacy of well-known people according to the slogan, "Everyone is entitled to know everything." But this is a false slogan of a false era. Far greater in value is the forfeited right of people not to know, not to have their divine souls stuffed with gossip, nonsense, vain talk. A person who works and leads a meaningful life has no need for this excessive and burdening flow of information. Hastiness and superficiality, these are the psychic diseases of the 20th century, and more than anywhere else, this is manifested in the press. In-depth analysis of a problem is anathema to the press. It is contrary to its nature. The press merely picks out sensational formulas. Such as it is, however, the press has become the greatest power within the Western countries, exceeding that of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Yet one would like to ask, according to what law has it been elected, and to whom is it responsible? In the Communist East, a journalist is frankly appointed as a state official. But who has voted Western journalists into their positions of power? For how long a time, and with what prerogatives? There is yet another surprise for someone coming from the totalitarian East with its rigorously unified press. One discovers a common trend of preferences within the Western press as a whole. The spirit of the time, generally accepted patterns of judgment, and maybe common corporate interests, the sum effect being not competition, but unification. Unrestrained freedom exists for the press, but not for the readership, because newspapers mostly transmit in a forceful and emphatic way those opinions which do not too openly contradict their own and that general trend. Without any censorship in the West, fashionable trends of thought and ideas are fastidiously separated from those that are not fashionable, and the latter, without even being forbidden, have little chance of finding their way into periodicals or books or being heard in colleges. Your scholars are free in the legal sense, but they are hemmed in by the idols of the prevailing fad. There is no open violence as in the East. However, a selection dictated by fashion and the need to accommodate mass standards frequently prevents the most independent-minded persons from contributing to public life, and gives rise to dangerous herd instincts that block successful development. In America, I have received letters from highly intelligent persons, maybe a teacher in a faraway small college, who could do much for the renewal and salvation of his country, but the country cannot hear him because the media will not provide him with a forum. This gives birth to strong mass prejudices, to a blindness which is perilous in our dynamic era. An example is the self-deluding interpretation of the state of affairs in the contemporary world that functions as a sort of a petrified armor around people's minds, to such a degree that human voices from 17 countries of Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia cannot pierce it. It will be broken only by the inexorable crowbar of events. I have mentioned a few traits of Western life which surprise and shock a new arrival to this world. The purpose and scope of this speech will not allow me to continue such a survey, in particular to look into the impact of these characteristics on important aspects of a nation's life, such as elementary education, advanced education in the humanities, and art. It is almost universally recognized that the West shows all the world the way to successful economic development, even though in the past years it has been sharply offset by chaotic inflation. However, many people living in the West are dissatisfied with their own society. They despise it or accuse it of no longer being up to the level of maturity attained by mankind. And this causes many to sway towards socialism, which is a false and dangerous current. I hope that no one present will suspect me of expressing my partial criticism of the Western system in order to suggest socialism as an alternative. No. With the experience of a country where socialism has been realized, I shall certainly not speak for such an alternative. The mathematician Igor Shafarevich, a member of the Soviet Academy of Science, has written a brilliantly argued book entitled Socialism. This is a penetrating historical analysis demonstrating that socialism of any type and shade leads to a total destruction of the human spirit and to a leveling of mankind into death. Shafarevich's book was published in France almost 2 years ago, and so far no one has been found to refute it. It will shortly be published in English in the U.S. But should I be asked instead whether I would propose the West, such as it is today, as a model to my country, I would frankly have to answer negatively. No, I could not recommend your society as an ideal for the transformation of ours. Through deep suffering, people in our country have now achieved a spiritual development of such intensity that the Western system in its present state of spiritual exhaustion does not look attractive. Even those characteristics of your life which I have just enumerated are extremely saddening. A fact which cannot be disputed is the weakening of human personality in the West, while in the East it has become firmer and stronger. 6 decades for our people and 3 decades for the people of Eastern Europe. During that time we have been through a spiritual training far in advance of Western experience. The complex and deadly crush of life has produced stronger, deeper, more interesting personalities than those generated by standardized Western well-being. Therefore, if our society were to be transformed into yours, It would mean an improvement in certain aspects, but also a change for the worst in some particularly significant points. Of course, a society cannot remain in an abyss of lawlessness, as is the case in our country, but it is also demeaning for it to stay on such a soulless and smooth plane of legalism, as is the case in yours. After the suffering of decades of violence and oppression, the human soul longs for things higher, warmer, and purer than those offered by today's mass living habits, introduced as by a calling card by the revolting invasion of commercial advertising, by TV stupor, by intolerable music. All this is visible to numerous observers from all the worlds of our planet. The Western way of life is less and less likely to become the leading model. There are telltale symptoms by which history gives warning to a threatened or perishing society. Such are, for instance, a decline of the arts or a lack of great statesmen. Indeed, sometimes the warnings are quite explicit and concrete. The center of your democracy and of your culture is left without electric power for only a few hours only, and all of a sudden crowds of American citizens start looting and creating havoc. The smooth surface film must be very thin, then the social system quite unstable and unhealthy. But the fight for our planet, physical and spiritual, a fight of cosmic proportions, is not a vague matter of the future. It has already started. The forces of evil have begun their decisive offensive. You can feel their pressure. Yet your screens and publications are full of prescribed smiles and raised glasses. What is the joy about? Very well, very well-known representatives of your society, such as George Kennan, say, we cannot apply moral criteria to politics. Thus we mix good and evil, right and wrong, and make space for the absolute triumph of absolute evil in the world. Only moral criteria can help the West against communism's well-planned world strategy. There are no other criteria. Practical or occasional considerations of any kind will inevitably be swept away by strategy. After a certain level, the problem has been reached. Legalistic thinking induces paralysis. It prevents one from seeing the scale and the meaning of events. In spite of the abundance of information, or maybe partly because of it, the West has great difficulty in finding its bearings amid contemporary events. There have been naive predictions by some American experts who believed that Angola would become the Soviet Union's Vietnam, or that the impudent Cuban expeditions in Africa would best be stopped by special U.S. courtesy to Cuba. Kennan's advice to his own country to begin unilateral disarmament belongs to the same category. If you only knew how the youngest of the officials in Moscow's old square roar with laughter at your political wizards. As to Fidel Castro, he openly scorns the United States, boldly sending his troops to distant adventures from his country right next to yours. However, the most cruel mistake occurred with the failure to understand the Vietnam War. Some people sincerely wanted all wars to stop just as soon as possible. Others believed that the way should be left open for national or communist self-determination in Vietnam or in Cambodia, as we see today with particular clarity. But in fact, members of the U.S. anti-war movement became accomplices in the betrayal of Far Eastern nations, in the genocide and the suffering today imposed on 30 million people there. Do these convinced pacifists now hear the moans coming from there? Do they understand their responsibility today? Or do they prefer not to hear? The American intelligentsia lost its nerve, and as a consequence the danger has come much closer to the United States. But there is no awareness of this. Your short-sighted politician who signed the hasty Vietnam capitulation seemingly gave America a carefree breathing pause. However, 100-fold Vietnam now looms over you. Small Vietnam had been a warning and an occasion to mobilize the nation's courage, but if the full might of America suffered a full-fledged defeat at the hands of a small, communist half-country, how can the West hope to stand firm in the future? I have said on another occasion that in the 20th century, Western democracy has not won any major war by itself. Each time it shielded itself with an ally possessing a powerful land army whose philosophy it did not question. In World War II against Hitler, instead of winning the conflict with its own forces, which would certainly have been sufficient, Western democracy raised up another enemy, one that would prove worse and more powerful, since Hitler had neither the resources nor the people nor the ideas with broad appeal, nor such a large number of supporters in the West, a fifth column as the Soviet Union possessed. Some Western voices already have spoken of the need of a protective screen against hostile forces in the next world conflict. In this case, the shield would be China. But I would not wish such an outcome to any country in the world. First of all, it is again a doomed alliance with evil. It would grant the United States a respite, but when, at a later date, China with its billion people would turn around armed with American weapons, America itself would fall victim to a Cambodia-style genocide. And yet no weapons, no matter how powerful, can help the West until it overcomes its loss of will power. In a state of psychological weakness, weapons even become a burden for the capitulating side. To defeat oneself, one must also be ready to die. There is little such readiness in a society raised in the cult of material well-being. Nothing is left in this case but concessions, attempts to gain time, and betrayal. Thus, at the shameful Belgrade Conference, free Western diplomats in their weakness surrendered the line of defense for which enslaved members of the Helsinki watch groups are sacrificing their lives. Western thinking has become conservative. The world situation must stay as it is at any cost. There must be no changes. This debilitating dream of a status quo is the symptom of a society that has ceased to develop. But one must be blind in order not to see that the oceans no longer belong to the West, while the land under its domination keeps shrinking. The two so-called world wars, they were by far not on a world scale, not yet, constituted the internal self-destruction of the small, progressive West, which has thus prepared its own end. The next war, which does not have to be an atomic one, I do not believe it will be, may well bury Western civilization forever. In the face of such a danger, with such historical values in your past, with such a high level of attained freedom and apparently of devotion to it, how is it possible to lose to such an extent the will to defend oneself? How has this unfavorable relation of forces come about? How did the West decline from its triumphal march to its present debility? Have there been fatal turns and losses of direction in its development? It does not seem so. The West kept advancing steadily in accordance with its proclaimed social intentions, hand in hand with a dazzling progress in technology, and all of a sudden it found itself in its present state of weakness. This means that the mistake must be at the root, at the very foundation of thought in modern times. I refer to the prevailing Western view of the world, which was born in the Renaissance and has found political expression since the Age of Enlightenment. It became the basis for political and social doctrine and could be called rationalistic humanism or humanistic autonomy, the proclaimed and practiced autonomy of man from any higher force above him. It could also be called anthropocentricity, with man seen as the center of all. The turn introduced by the Renaissance was probably inevitable historically. The Middle Ages had come to a natural end by exhaustion, having become an intolerable despotic repression of man's physical nature in favor of the spiritual one. But then we recoiled from the spirit and embraced all that is material excessively and incommensurately. The humanistic way of thinking which had produced itself our guide did not admit the existence of intrinsic evil in man, nor did it see any task higher than the attainment of happiness on earth. It started modern Western civilization on the dangerous trend of worshiping man and his material needs. Everything beyond physical well-being and the accumulation of material goods, all other human requirements and characteristics of a subtler and higher nature, were left outside the area of attention of state and social systems, as if human life did not have any higher meaning. Thus gaps were left open for evil, and its drafts blow freely today. Mere freedom per se does not in the least solve all the problems of human life, and even adds a number of new ones. And yet, in early democracies, as in American democracy at the time of its birth, all individual human rights were granted on the ground that man is God's creature. That is, freedom was given to the individual conditionally, in the assumption of his constant religious responsibility. Such was the heritage of the preceding 1,000 years. 200 or even 50 years ago, it would have seemed quite impossible in America that an individual be granted boundless freedom with no purpose, simply for the satisfaction of his whims. Subsequently, however, all such limitations were eroded everywhere in the West. A total emancipation occurred from the moral heritage of Christian centuries, with their great reserves of mercy and sacrifice. State systems were becoming ever more materialistic. The West has finally achieved the rights of man, and even to excess. But man's sense of responsibility to God and society has grown dimmer and dimmer. In the past decades, the legalistic selfishness of the Western approach to the world has reached its peak, and the world has found itself in a harsh spiritual crisis and a political impasse. All the celebrated technological achievements of progress, including the conquest of outer space, do not redeem the 20th century's moral poverty, which no one could have imagined even as late as the 19th century. As humanism in its development was becoming more and more materialistic, it also increasingly allowed its concepts to be first used by socialism and then by communism, so that Karl Marx was able to say in 1844 that communism is naturalized humanism. This statement has proved to be not entirely unreasonable. One does see the same stones in the foundation of an eroded humanism and of any type of socialism, boundless materialism, freedom from religion and religious responsibility, which under communist regimes attains the stage of anti-religious dictatorship. Concentration on social structures with an allegedly scientific approach. This last is typical both of the Age of Enlightenment and of Marxism. It is no accident that in all of communism's rhetorical vows revolve around man, with a capital M, and his earthly happiness. At first glance it seems an ugly parallel, common traits in the thinking and way of life of today's West and today's East. But such is the logic of materialistic development. The interrelationship is such, moreover, that the current of materialism which is farthest to the left, and hence the most consistent, always proves to be stronger, more attractive and victorious. Humanism, which has lost its Christian heritage, cannot prevail in this competition. Thus, during the past centuries, and especially in recent decades as the process became more acute, the alignment of forces was as follows. Liberalism was inevitably pushed aside by radicalism. Radicalism had to surrender to socialism, and socialism could not stand up to communism. The communist regime in the East could endure and grow to the enthusiastic support of an enormous number of Western intellectuals who, feeling the kinship, refused to see communism's crimes, and when they no longer could do so, they tried to justify these crimes. The problem persists. In our eastern countries, communism has suffered a complete ideological defeat. It is zero and less than zero. And yet, Western intellectuals still look at it with considerable interest and empathy, and this is precisely what makes it so immensely difficult for the West to withstand the East. I am not examining the case of a disaster brought on by a world war and the changes which it would produce in society. But as long as we wake up every morning under a peaceful sun, we must lead an everyday life. Yet there is a disaster which is already very much with us, and I am referring to the calamity of an autonomous, irreligious, humanistic consciousness. It has made man the measure of all things on earth, imperfect man, who is never free of pride, self-interest, envy, vanity, and dozens of other defects. We are now paying for the mistakes which were not properly appraised at the beginning of the journey. On the way from the Renaissance to our days, we have enriched our experience, but we have lost the concept of a supreme, complete entity which used to restrain our passions and our irresponsibility. We have placed too much hope in politics and social reforms, only to find out that we were being deprived of our most precious possession, our spiritual life. It is trampled by the party mob in the East, by the commercial one in the West. This is the essence of the crisis. The split in the world is less terrifying than the similarity of the disease afflicting its main sections. If, as claimed by humanism, man were born only to be happy, he would not be born to die. Since his body is doomed to death, his task on earth evidently must be more spiritual. Not a total engrossment in everyday life, not the search for the best ways to obtain material goods, and then their carefree consumption. It has to be fulfillment of a permanent, earnest duty, so that one's life journey may become above all an experience of moral growth, to leave life a better human being than one started it. It is imperative to reappraise the scale of the usual human values. Its present incorrectness is astounding. It is not possible that assessment of the president's performance should be reduced to the question of how much money one makes or the availability of gasoline. Only by the voluntary nurturing in ourselves of freely accepted and serene self-restraint can mankind rise above the world stream of materialism. Today it would be retrogressive to hold on to the ossified formulas of the Enlightenment. Such social dogmatism leaves us helpless before the trials of our times, even if we are spared destruction by war. Life will have to change in order not to perish on its own. We cannot avoid reassessing the fundamental definitions of human life and human society. Is it true that man is above everything? Is there no superior spirit above him? Is it right that man's life and society's activity should be ruled by material expansion above all? Is it permissible to promote such expansion to the detriment of our integral spiritual life? If the world has not approached its end, it has reached a major watershed in history, equal in importance to the turn of the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will demand from us a spiritual blaze. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life, where our physical nature will not be cursed, as in the Middle Ages. But even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon, as in the modern era. This ascension is similar to climbing onto the next anthropological stage. No one on earth has any other way left but upward. This concludes the commencement address delivered at Harvard University, June 8, 1978, by Aleksander I. Solzhenitsyn. Excerpts from Of Flight and Life by Charles A. Lindbergh, 1948. Preface. There are times in life when one feels an overwhelming desire to communicate belief to others, to band together with one's fellow men in support of a common cause. I have felt such a desire on 3 occasions. The first as a young pilot, when I became convinced that man had a great destiny in the air, that planes would someday cross continents and oceans with their cargoes of people, mail, and freight. I believed that America should lead the world in the development of flight. I devoted my life to planes and engines, to surveying airlines, to preaching, whenever men would listen, the limitless future of the sky. The second time was in Europe, when I saw our Western peoples turning their resources into bombing planes for war. I believed that a conflict between English and German groups of nations would leave Europe prostrate, destroy her cities, kill her finest men, and dangerously increase the Soviet government's strength. For 5 years at home and abroad, I spoke, wrote, and argued against a fratricidal war. I advocated that democratic nations stand by and arm while Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia fought out their totalitarian ideas. With Hitler and Stalin wishing to exterminate each other, and with Nazi forces already pointed eastward, it seemed to me the greatest folly to draw German guns to Western Europe against a France and England unprepared. After fighting began, I pleaded that a negotiated peace between Allied and Axis powers would leave free peoples stronger than a victory based on an unconditional surrender. I was convinced that it was best for America to keep out of Europe's internal wars, not to add to a suicidal conflagration which would greatly weaken our civilization in a period when it had vital need for strength to face the gigantic problems of modern life which lay ahead. The third time is at this moment, 1948. We are now facing these problems intensified by years of war. We are in the grip of a scientific materialism caught in a vicious cycle where our society today seems to depend on regimentation and weapons which will ruin us tomorrow. I believe the values we are creating and the standards we are now following will lead to the end of our civilization, and that if we do not control our science by a higher moral force, it will destroy us with its materialistic values, its rocket aircraft, and its atomic bombs, as it has already destroyed large parts of Europe. Because of this belief, I have written the following book divided into 2 parts. In part 1, I have described 3 among the many experiences of life which led to the arguments and conclusions in part 2. In general, these chapters represent a journey from my early confidence in the limitless future of scientific man to an apprehension of the crisis to which a scientific materialism has led him. In attacking scientific materialism, I fully realize that science has become the victim of its technologists, as religion became the victim of its fanatics. Just as the spiritual truths of Christ and Lao Tzu were perverted by the temporal exploitation of Christian and Taoist creeds, the intellectual truths of great scientists are being perverted by the material exploitation of industry and war. Hiroshima was as far from the intention of the pure scientist as the Inquisition was from the Sermon on the Mount. The scientist is no more guilty of the situation we are in today than those of us who have made improper use of his discoveries. Our problems are mutual. We must work them out together. Our survival depends on it. I have written this book in an attempt to clarify the crisis we face, to communicate with men and women of similar concern, to search for a solution. Excerpt from Part 1, Germany, 1945. The country below was green and beautiful, dark pine-covered hills, well-kept strips of fields punctuated by the tile roofs and crooked streets of ancient villages. Could this be the land so devastated by 6 long years of war? I was wedged in between the tire of a Navy jeep and the window of an Army transport plane on a mission to study enemy jet and rocket aircraft. We had just crossed the German border en route to Paris, from Paris to Munich. It was May of 1945. The last of Hitler's armies had surrendered. There was no change. This was the same Germany I had flown over before hostilities began. The explosives and war machines of man seemed to have left as little mark as a pebble dropped on the surface of a pool. Already fields of grain were smoothing out the ripples made by shell and tank track, After all, it was the farmer's plow that painted man's picture on the earth. A crop of wheat brushed over in a single stroke the scratches made by centuries of war. It was hard to believe that those little pockmarks on a hillside had been foxholes guarding human life, or that the faint, equidistant lines curving in around them were the tracks of an exterminating tank. That raveled thread lying casually on a pasture was where modern youth had fought, and the button-sized shell splotches across it added, died. My eyes swept out toward the horizon. Even the widest trenches disappeared in the angle of distance. The sun-bathed fields, the forests of southern Germany lay serene as a bomb and shell had never screamed through air, except, and that was the flaw to this crystal of earth and sky, except for the pallor of that distant city. It drew my eyes, and I could not take them from it. What could be so disturbing in a shade of gray and yellow miles away? There was some property to a bombed city, some emanation of death that accompanied the rays reflected from its ruins. As human death pierces through a room, that city pierced the sky. I forgot farms and villages, trenches and tank tracks. I could no longer see the beauty of earth or experience the joy of flight. As we drew closer, the features of death emerged. Rubbled streets, gutted buildings, ragged walls. This had been a city inhabited by men. Street after street lined with blasted factories, offices, and homes, open roofs and fallen floors, smudged by fire, deserted by life. And this was only one of the bombed cities of Europe. There were scores of them. Here in these ruins, not in the countryside around them, one saw the true significance of modern war. One saw more deeply than war to the insecurity of man, the temptation of science, the values of God. It was afternoon before we had unloaded our jeep, packed our equipment, and found our way into the city of Munich. Down on the surface of the earth, between mounds of shattered brick and mortar, looking up to the sky through gaping roofs, seeing old women and young children hunting food in piles of army refuse, I realized that a civilization had collapsed. One which was basically our own, stemming from the same Christian beliefs, rooted in similar history and culture. How fragile civilization had become, viewed through the lens of modern science, how vulnerable to the eyes of the bombardier. For it resides in cities, in those little patches here and there, 20,000 feet below, dwarfed by the great expanse of field and forest, yet such easy targets for the bomb site. A formation of aircraft passes high overhead, a button is pressed, black dots tumble through the air, a pinpoint on earth erupts, and civilization is rubble, smoke, and flame. I felt rising apprehension for the future. These cities I had driven through pre-war Munich 7 years before were once like ours, pulsing with both life and power, secure as steel, permanent as stone. If this had happened in Europe, why could it not also happen in America? In another generation, might New York, Detroit, Chicago look like this? What quality had we to save us that Germany had not? The Germans, too, had been an educated people, with Western minds and hearts. Few nations had contributed more to our civilization in the past, in art, music, religion, philosophy, science, and science above all in modern times. Millions of Germans had devoted their lives to the discovery and development of scientific knowledge, in mathematics, in physics, in chemistry, in subjects which form the foundation of modern civilization. They were among the leaders of the world. They had worshipped science. To it they had sacrificed the quality of life, yet they had not gained the power to survive. Perhaps here was a key to my question. Perhaps survival, in the last analysis, was fully as dependent on the quality of life as on the power of arms, dependent on a perpetual balance of spiritual and material forces. The Germans had lost this balance. The temptation of scientific power had been too much for these citizens. With science they felt they could be supermen. They could rule the earth. Heedless of warning cries which arose both within and without their nation, they had turned their backs on the deeper human values of their heritage. Instead of balancing science with other fields of wisdom, they had let it dominate them, turned it loose in war and conquest. In their search for materialistic power, they had set up science as their god, and science had destroyed them. Is there a warning in these German cities which we in America should heed? Was there something inherently self-destroying in the worship of science, as I had suspected at Willow Run? Was science's power of survival only temporary, capable of winning battles but not saving man? Was there something even inherently dangerous in the unguided search for knowledge? Before this war, I had regarded the fear of knowledge as ignorant superstition. Knowledge brought truth, and how could truth blind or injure man? But perhaps there was a wisdom in the old myth of the Garden of Eden. But of the tree of knowledge thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. In this early record, both man's fascination and his fear of knowledge are recorded. That he must search for it was accepted. That it involved great danger for him was already understood. Here in what had been a human city, I saw the danger of knowledge, the amorality of truth. Like steel, truth could bring evil as well as good, destroy as well as construct. Its achievements depended less on its own substance than on a guiding power beyond, a power not bound up in formulas of knowledge. There was truth in the mathematics that designed a high explosive bomb, in the machines that shaped the wings of a bomber, in the masses of data and cold logic which took men's minds from government and God until a Nazi party rose to shatter Europe. But it was truth unguided by moral principles. It was scientific truth unbalanced by the truths of religion. The German scientist had partaken of a fruit from which death had surely followed. Then it was the quality of knowledge rather than its amount that mattered, the use of truth as much as its possession. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. In this spiritual truth of religion there was more value than in any material truth of science. The contrast between city and countryside of post-war Germany marked unmistakably its wisdom. The truths of the city had sown aircraft and explosives, and to the city aircraft and explosives had returned, leaving the farmer relatively untouched to reap his peaceful crops of grain. Here in Germany the truths of science and the truths of religion had clashed, and religion remained to teach its ancient lesson. It was true that modern civilization could not live without science, as I discovered in the South Pacific. It was also true that science alone lacked the wisdom needed to survive. In Germany, I learned that if his civilization is to continue, modern man must direct the material power of his science by the spiritual truths of his God. This is 1948. World War II is over. Our soldiers have been victorious on every battlefront. Their courage, the developments of our science, our modern industry, the alliance we made with the Soviets, enabled us to carry destruction to our enemies on a scale never recorded before. On military standards, we won decisively. But, in a deeper sense, have we won? Or is World War II only a successful military campaign in a vast conflict which stretches backward through World War I and forward through World War III? A conflict for earthly leadership, wealth, and power. Most of the issues for which we fought have not been settled. Our underlying objectives have not been attained. Our victory has not brought peace to the world. It has established neither democratic ideals nor the security of nations. The Atlantic Charter is non-existent. The four freedoms do not thrive. Stalin now holds most of what we fought to keep Hitler from obtaining. As England won a war and lost an empire. We have stamped out the menace of Nazi Germany, only to find that we have created the still greater menace of Soviet Russia, behind whose iron curtain lies a record of bloodshed and oppression never equaled. Like a cloud overhanging our satisfaction in defeating our enemies is the realization that the science which gave us military victory is destroying the very civilization which created it. Starvation, despair, the millions of dead, and the ruined cities of Europe form stark evidence. Our modern bombs have razed in a few hours cities our ancestors spent centuries in building. Piles of rubble lie where cathedrals stood. In suburbs and on battlefields, crosses mark the graves of fathers and mothers of a genius which might have flowered. Western nation has fought Western nation until European peoples are exhausted and living in constant dread of the godless philosophy and armies of the Soviet. Can a civilized man view the world today and say, we won? Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, but proved that it is a shallow victory which leaves a prostrate people. As the wars between Athens and Sparta brought the downfall of Greece, those between England and Germany, with the aid of scientific weapons, have brought the downfall of all Europe, which was, until this war, the stronghold of our civilization. The price of military success to date has been staggering. European peoples are now too weak to protect even their own borders. America is the only Western country in which great strength remains. The fate of Western civilization now rests on our shoulders. We have seen it weakened by World War I, much of it destroyed by World War II, and all that is left threatened by World War III, which each war rising in scientific terror. They that take the sword shall perish with the sword. In order to defeat our enemies, we have developed weapons which threaten all that remains of civilization and the very existence of mankind. In spite of our strength and our prosperity in this country, our future was never less secure. As the fallen walls of Coventry should have warned Germany of the fate of her own cities, the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki should be a warning to America. Our atomic bombs return from Japan to haunt us, and in our science we foresee our doom. The tragedy of scientific man is that he has found no way to guide his own discoveries to a constructive end. He has devised no weapon so terrible that he has not used it. He has guarded none so carefully that his enemies have not eventually obtained it and turned it against him. He has developed a system in which his security today and tomorrow seems to depend on building weapons which will destroy him the day after. He has become so hypnotized by his search for knowledge that he must go on discovering and experimenting, even though it leads to his own annihilation. With the key of success, he has turned loose forces which he cannot re-imprison. In the past, time and space and man's own weakness localized his destructive power. Movement by horse and sail was slow, gunpowder a weak explosive. Even with the airplanes and high explosives of World War II, the great majority of warring people have survived. We in America were beyond effective range of our enemy's aircraft. The cost of transoceanic bombing was out of proportion to the damage it could inflict. The costs protected us as the Channel protected England in a seaborne age. They can no longer do so in a rocket atomic era. Only a decade ago, both rockets and atomic energy seemed problems that could be left safely to some great-grandchild's generation. But war turned our best minds to weapons of destruction. With thousands of technicians and billions of dollars at their disposal, science again accomplished the impossible and showed the relativity of time. They reached into the future and took the problem of long-range rockets and atomic explosives from our great-grandchildren's hands and placed it like a burning coal in our own. Time has become disjointed in this modern world where man still ages with the seasons, while science brings more changes to his life in a single generation than it underwent in the previous 1,000 years. From father to son, here in America we have passed from the Indian massacre to the atomic annihilation. We are dazed by our own accomplishments, awed by our knowledge, fearful of what the future holds. We know that within the next decade it will be technically possible to assemble weapons which can destroy every city in the world within hours after the start of war. We have developed new lethal gases, new methods of spreading disease, new ways of killing with radioactivity. Atomic bombs could be concealed by enemy saboteurs. Rocket missiles launched abroad would reach this country in less time than we could evacuate our cities, and we have no effective way of stopping them in flight. There are alarming indications that the possessor of modern scientific knowledge may be able to destroy all life over large areas of the Earth's surface. Some scientists have predicted that man will gain the power to detonate the planet itself. Such is the picture that confronts modern man at the conclusion of World War II. The devastation that could be wrought by an atomic age war is too appalling to be fully realized. The vision stuns our imagination, but if present trends continue, it is only a question of time before such a war will come. In both hemispheres today I see the same picture on a vaster scale that I saw in Europe a decade ago. I watch a similar construction of arms, similar conflict of ideals, similar propaganda, similar political arguments and moves. The problem we face is exemplified in our relationship with Russia. Secret commitments made by President Roosevelt at the Tehran and Yalta, the crushing defeat of Japan, and our terms of unconditional surrender to Germany have left Moscow's communist government by far the strongest power in the Eastern Hemisphere. Soviet political philosophy is highly divergent from our own. Russian citizens live under a ruthless dictatorial system. Millions of them are in concentration camps today, denied justice, cut off from communication. Under the Soviets, unknown numbers of men still labor as slaves. We know that Russia is arming, that she is exerting every effort to gain our knowledge of atomic energy and to build atomic bombs. History tells us that two great powers have never lived within reach of one another without eventual war. Persia and Greece, Carthage and Rome, Germany and England, Japan and the United States are only a few examples. There is little in our relationship with the Soviets to make us believe that in this respect the future will not repeat the past. Their spies and agitators are active in our country. Our conferences seethe in controversy. Our distrust increases. We are unable to agree upon effective methods of representation for a peaceful organization of the world. As to religion, as to human rights, there lie chasms between us, seemingly impossible to bridge. The right to worship, the right to speak, the right to live in freedom are qualities dearer than life to the American mind and heart. They are qualities which the Soviet denies even to a greater extent than they were denied in Nazi Germany. If the present armament race continues, it is only a question of time before Russia and the United States have assembled weapons with which they can destroy each other. We are already spending the greater portion of our national budget in paying for past and preparing for future wars. As far as we can now foresee, such expenditure must not only continue but increase. Whatever security we attain in the future may depend on every child, man, and woman in the country being trained to take their part in war. Let us imagine ourselves a few years from now, poised for war, as Europe was in 1939. Our radars search the northern skies. We know that over the top of the earth, hundreds of atomic rockets lie aimed at American cities. In our military emplacements, hundreds more lie ready for instant counterattack. We do not know how many of our cities contain the hidden bombs of enemy saboteurs, or what deadly diseases for plants, animals, and humans may be spread among us. From day to day, from hour to hour, we, our families, our civilization, exist at the mercy of a dictator's whim, and depend on some fanatic's finger not closing an electric switch. It is an intolerable concept, but it is a picture of the future toward which we are now heading. This is technically possible with bombs we have already tested, with biological warfare we know how to wage, with rockets we can soon design. But scientists predict still more effective methods of destruction. They warn that if we do not find some way to control the production of atomic weapons, the first nation to press this button of war will win, if any victor emerges from such a catastrophe. Can we turn these trends? Can we succeed where men before us have always failed? Almost certainly civilization, possibly human survival, depends on our ability to control the use of modern weapons. Obviously, this requires an organization of nations of the world. But who is to control such an organization? Since the United States emerged from the war as the strongest power on Earth, and since only we now possess atomic bombs, many people argue that we should act as leader, judge and police, and use force if necessary to organize for peace and keep the world disarmed. But sooner, as in the case of modern Germany, or later, as in the case of ancient Rome, nations which place too much emphasis on force meet with disaster. In Europe, the earth is seared with the example of a people who too facilely turned their science loose for war. And even the legions of Caesar were unable to perpetuate themselves. Rule by force begets willingness to die for freedom. If we attempt to rule by force alone, we will create in other men the desire to destroy us. We will build hatred and fanaticism, which wait only for the opportunity to hurl back at us the very weapons with which we govern. Then our security would necessitate training American youth in the regime of the policeman and the soldier, and our existence would depend on a Spartan discipline which generation after generation could never be relaxed. We would have to give up the way of life and the ideals we now believe in. Realizing the danger and excessive use of force, other people advocate rule by world government, in which all nations are equally represented. But the failure of the League of Nations of the First World War and the difficulties encountered by the United Nations of the Second show that rule by vote also has its limitations. What do we mean by equal representation? Certainly we cannot give one vote to Costa Rica and only one to the United States with nearly 300 times the population. But if we apportion votes according to the number of inhabitants a country has, then leadership would pass from our Western peoples who have built this civilization to the great masses of Asia. The high birth rates of ignorance would outvote the low birth rates of education, and the weapons of Western science, from aircraft to atomic bomb, would be controlled by the desires of the East. Based on the literal equality of man, Japan, China, and India would have nearly 4 times the influence of the United States, Great Britain, and France. Voting strength and fighting strength would be torn apart, with the inevitable result of revolution and war. We cannot escape the fact that our civilization was built, and still depends upon the quality rather than the equality of men. Progress and quality are inseparable. That is a law of life which man cannot change. Where there is quality in life, it surges forward. It was the quality of man that gave him leadership on earth, dominance over the sheer strength of ape and tiger. It was the quality of the Greeks that defeated the Persian host at Marathon. It was the quality of the Christian religion that carried it over the Western world against what seemed overwhelming opposition. It was the quality of our American forebears that subdued a wilderness and won independence from a stronger power. For Americans, the doctrine of universal equality is a doctrine of death. If we ever become an equal people among other peoples of the world, our civilization will fall, and our equality with it. Our security, our freedom, our democratic system itself depends on maintaining an extraordinary quality in our people. Let us make no mistake. The political equality we practice in this country is a recognition of quality in a common cause and background, a uniting together for the protection of our nation and civilization and for the advancement of the ideals that we hold. It is an equality of brothers striving for the quality of man. If our American way of life cannot exist in a world ruled entirely by force, neither can it continue in a world government based on the numerical equality of men. Since the densely populated countries would control by vote, our borders would be thrown open to their immigration. We would be in competition with peoples who live and labor on lower standards than we have ever known, with peoples whose ideas and ideals diverge greatly from our own. Since we would no longer have the means of law enforcement, we would be bound by a foreign code of law. It is unlikely that a world government in which Asia cast 1 billion votes would maintain taxes, regulations, and freedom of action which would permit our American standards to go on. It is essential that we realize these facts before we give up our independence and the weapons which enable us to maintain our freedom. We must realize that regardless of original intent and promises, such a world government carries no reliable guarantee of continuing equality and a democratic system for Americans. It too would be subject to intrigue and usurpation by a dictator, or the majority of its people would be inexperienced in the safeguards essential to maintaining democracy and freedom. In fact, hundreds of millions of the people who would be citizens of a world organization have been educated under political philosophies antagonistic to our own. Suppose we turned our atomic bombs, our aircraft, and other weapons over to an international police force. If we insisted on control of that police, it would, from a world standpoint, be a non-democratic organization. But if we did not insist on control, we would be completely at its mercy, with no longer the power to maintain our independence. Then, disarmed, and with only a minority vote, how could we stop a foreign demagogue from rising on a wave of intrigue and popularity to control the police force, which controls the earth? Such a dictator would control the world as Hitler controlled Germany, as Stalin controls Russia. What is our course to be? Our survival? The future of our civilization? Possibly the existence of mankind depends on American leadership, upon the wisdom of our policies and action. On the one hand, we know that peace has never existed for long where some great power has not enforced it by military strength. On the other, we have seen that military strength is like a flame which consumes the very stuff from which it springs. Great military peoples have conquered their known world time and time again through the centuries, only to die out in the inevitable ashes of their fire. Well over 2,000 years ago, the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu concluded that weapons often turn upon the wielder, an army's harvest is a waste of thorns. We may have to resort to arms in the future, as we have in the past. We may have to use them to prevent an atomic war from being launched against us. But let us have the wisdom to realize that the use of force is a sign of weakness on a higher plane, and that a policy based primarily on recourse to arms will sooner or later fail. It is clear that the answer is not to be found either in rule by force alone or by equality alone. Each has been tried and each has failed. Our leadership, to be successful, must contain elements of force, it must contain elements of equality, but it must also contain elements which reach far behind the materialism of force and equality. We must strive to achieve a civilization so satisfactory to men that its force can remain unused in the background, while the question of equality becomes akin to the relationship of head and hand. If we succeed, it will be less by forcing our system of democracy on others than by setting an example others wish to follow, less by using arms than by avoiding them, less by pointing out the mote in another's eye than by removal of the beam in our own. The improvement of our way of life is more important than the spreading of it. If we make it satisfactory enough, it will spread automatically. If we do not, no strength of arms can permanently impose it. In the final analysis, our future depends upon ourselves, our ability, our character, our ideals. If we are to lead mankind through these black years, if we are to be successful in war and peace, we must have clearly in mind what we desire in civilization and what constitutes human progress. The quality of a civilization depends on a balance of body, mind, and spirit in its people, measured on a scale less human than divine. No one of these elements can be greatly overemphasized or neglected without disastrous results. In places where education is too highly worshipped, birth rates rapidly decline. In battle, the physical prowess of the barbarian is no match for weapons of the educated mind. In India, overemphasis of religion went hand in hand with poverty, famine, and servility. In Germany, neglect of the spiritual led to a devastated land. Religion untempered by science brought the unchristian tortures of the Middle Ages. Science untempered by religion confronts us with the terrifying power of the modern atomic bomb. Our Western civilization represents a balance achieved by our forebears through thousands of years of struggle. We are the children of marriages influenced by the culture of Greece, guided by the sermons of Christ, inspired by the death of martyrs, instructed by Western knowledge, protected by Western arms. Let one of these elements be changed, and we would be a different people than we are today in body, mind, and spirit. We have in our very tissues qualities it takes millions of lifetimes and scores of generations to achieve. We are surrounded by a culture it has taken centuries to create. Drawing on the wisdom of the East, we have built our civilization of the West, a civilization which, with all its faults, has towered above its competitors. From the spirit of Christ, from the mind of science, from the bodily inheritance of farmers and pioneers, from such elements, Western man has achieved a balance unequaled by any civilization in the past. To survive, we must keep this balance. To progress, we must improve it. Science is upsetting it with an overemphasis of mind and a neglect of spirit and body. Its bombs are only a wartime manifestation of the materialism with which it attacks all life. We are becoming the slaves of science, slaves of its war machines, its mines, its factories, its offices, and balance sheets, its bureaucracy and regulations. Living in rented apartments, jamming roads and subways, punching time clocks, sitting pauncily at desks, cramming the minds of his children with technical knowledge, varying his peacetime routine to hurtle through the sky with his bombs in war or to jolt through the exploding hell of a battlefield, modern man sacrifices health of body and freedom of spirit to the scientific idol of his time. Onto its altar go the smell of earth, the feel of weather, the sound of wind, the cricket, vision of fields and rivers, warmth of friendship, understanding of children, even the contemplation of God. All these are given over to a metallic, intellectual existence. Day after day, year after year, scientific man must serve the mechanistic utopia he has built. If he failed to do so, his entire system would collapse. He does not have the lash at his back as the common slave of old. He is driven by the more subtle whip of a system whose arms he needs for safety and whose dollars he must have for food, shelter, and the momentary dignity of life. A system which hypnotizes him into believing that he is free while he follows an iron-bound routine. A system which in its diabolical knowledge now holds the means of breeding even his mind and body for its service. Scientific man has enthroned knowledge as his idol and turned his back on God. He has begun a ceremonial dance to which there is no end. He must learn how to travel with more speed, to build bigger machines, invent more powerful explosives, produce more goods, teach his children more facts. Each development of science demands more science to maintain it, more to improve it, more to keep in advance of its use by our potential enemies. Scientific man is driven faster and faster by his system until he has no time left, no thought left, no appreciation left for man himself. He is dependent for his security on the increasing complication of a mechanistic organization which is already too complicated for him to control. His world is full of frustration, bitterness, strikes, and war. In turning his back on the gifts of nature he was born with, in replacing grass with concrete and sun with artificial sunlight, in making himself a Superman on Earth, scientific man loses contact with both the qualities of life and the truths essential to his own survival. He goes on amassing knowledge and power until he creates weapons with which he can destroy himself at will. Neglecting body, enthroning mind over spirit, dabbling with superhuman powers, striving to compete with God, the ruins of Europe and the new specter of an atomic rocket at last bring him face to face with his own frailty. Discovering, complicating, theorizing, quarreling, he approaches the terrible devastation of an atomic biologic war as though God had set a final limit to his sins. It should now be branded on our consciousness that unless science is controlled by a greater moral force, it will become the Antichrist prophesied by early Christians. If we are to keep it from destroying that part of our civilization which is left, if it is to be the great benefit of mankind that we have hoped, we must control it by a philosophy reaching beyond materialism, a philosophy rooted in the character of man and nourished by the eternal truths of God. A philosophy, like human life itself, cannot be imprisoned in a formula of words. It too must be living, growing, changing. It must combine the logic of the mind with the wisdom of the heart and merge both with the spirit's intuition. It must be strong enough to make science the servant of man, not his master. It must be wise enough to keep our Western nations from turning against each other in suicidal wars. It must hold the respect and warrant the cooperation of every people. Upon its truths we must build a faith that can withstand the materialism of these times. The survival of civilization depends upon its quality, and its quality depends in turn upon its balance, a balance which is being destroyed by the excesses of science. It is our mission to restore this balance by establishing a modern philosophy which justifies our continued leadership. How can such a philosophy be created, be translated into action? What effect can a single individual have in these cataclysmic times, one man or one woman among hundreds of millions, seemingly helpless as a sparrow in the path of a tornado, lost in the clash of governments and armies, dwarfed by science's enormous power, with nations and empires collapsing? When even the Christian church is quarreling and divided, what can a man himself accomplish? The answer lies in that quality with which man only, of all earthly life, is gifted. In each man is a spark, able to kindle new fires of human progress, new light for the human spirit. This ember may lie dormant through centuries of darkness, or it may be fanned to flames by the winds of a crisis sweeping over the earth, bringing others to life with its light and warmth. When enough of these fires are burning, they create a new dawn of spiritual understanding. The flame of a great people is formed. It is this spark a man or a woman can contribute, must contribute if our civilization goes on. The embryonic power, the intelligence, the unity with God for which there is no other source. It is from man the individual, not from governments or churches, that these sparks must come. They precede the flame of civilization, the light of religion. They must be forever rekindled. We are Western men and women. The qualities of our civilization lie within us. If we are to achieve new heights of progress, if we are to control the science we have created, if we are to lead the peoples of the earth to a better future, we must first search our own souls. If we truly believe in values above material things, all that is material must sooner or later adapt itself to them. Our customs, our marriages, our laws, our taxes, our methods of thinking and living, our relationship with others, even the outcome of our wars. Our standards must be based on man himself, his relationship to God and to his fellow men. They must have a place for those intangible human values which cannot be represented on a graph sheet, for simplicity and solitude, for truth and joy, for human brotherhood, for freedom of spirit, wisdom of mind, health of body. The scientific discoveries we make, the laws and policies we frame, must be judged on such standards, rather than on whether they will increase power or speed, trade or revenue or material possessions. We must stop measuring our standard of life by automobiles, production curves, and dollars of income. We must realize that the efficiency of a factory is less important than the character it builds in its workers and the effect of its product on our nation. No standard of living is high when jobs become drudgery and hours dreary, when young men and women cannot afford a family, where children are walled off by brick from sod and sky, where vast numbers of people are so encumbered with mechanistic detail that the spirit has no chance to rise. We must find ways of spreading the ownership of homes and land. If our civilization is to thrive, we must surround our people with the physical security, bodily vigor, and spiritual peace that come from close contact with earth and sky. We must consider the decentralization of industry on standards of human character and the satisfaction of living, rather than on those of dollar costs and units of production. If industrial efficiency is essential to our welfare and survival at present, the quality of a workman's life is still more important to our welfare and survival in the future. We must measure our education less by the amount of knowledge it instills in youthful minds than by the wisdom of living it creates. The amassing of knowledge is of negative value when it places business above family in the interests of men, and makes women consider careers ahead of children, when it instructs us in the magic that